Today's video is on trade. One of the biggest issues in economics is why are we so rich? Compared to all the people who've ever lived, the people watching this video are on average fantastically wealthy. Trade helps explain why we're so rich. In this video, I'm going to go through two extremely simple examples and show how in these examples, trade increases wealth. In later videos, I'll hopefully generalize from these examples and explain why trade increases the wealth of nations. Let's start with the example in front of us. There are two people and two goods. There's Bill and Cindy, and each of them makes bread and cake. Let's say that each of them wants 1 unit of bread and 1 cake. So without trade, well, they make the good themselves. So Bill spends 1 hour making bread and 4 hours making cake. So Bill gets what he wants by working 5 hours. And Cindy gets what she wants by also working 5 hours, but she has to work for 4 hours making bread and for 1 hour making cake. Now imagine these two discover what's going on. They learn about the other person and they think, hey, how could we trade to make us both better off? Why don't you pause this video and try to figure out the answer? What can these two individuals do to make themselves both better off? Okay, hopefully you figured out the answer. This is a pretty easy one. Bill would say, you know what? I'm really good at making bread compared to you, but you're really good at making cake compared to me. So how about this? Bill will say, I will make 2 breads and you make 2 cakes and then we'll trade 1 for 1. This way, at the end, we'll each have the same as if we didn't trade, but I'll have only had to work for 2 hours and you'll have only had to work for 2 hours, where if we didn't trade, we'd have to work for 5. This simple example shows how trade is like economic magic. Bill and Cindy, working much, much less, can produce the same amount as if they didn't trade. Or alternatively, if you made this a bit more complicated, you could imagine they could each work 5 hours, but they could each specialize in what they were best at, and at the end they could trade and both have more of everything. The reason they both can benefit from trade is because they're taking advantage of their absolute advantage. The term absolute advantage was first thought up by Adam Smith. And you have an absolute advantage at making a good if you can make it at a lower resource cost, and time is a resource. So in the previous example, Bill had an absolute advantage in making bread. Cindy had an absolute advantage in making cake. If you specialize in what you have an absolute advantage in and then trade with the other person, both of you can be made better off without hurting anyone. So this is why trade, as Adam Smith said, can increase the wealth of nations. Let's take another example. Now we have 2 new people and the things they care about are waffles and pies. To review what we mean by absolute advantage, why don't you figure out who has an absolute advantage in making waffles and who has it in pies? Okay, it turns out that Lisa has the absolute advantage in both. She can make waffles at a lower resource cost, 1 hour compared to 9, and she can make pies at a lower resource cost, 2 hours compared to 3. But can Lisa and Sam benefit from trade? I mean, in the previous example, one party had an absolute advantage in one of the relevant goods and the other in the other, and they each did what they had the absolute advantage in. But here, Lisa has an absolute advantage in both goods. So how can she benefit from trading with Sam? Sam is inferior to her in everything that matters. So do these two benefit from interacting, from trade? The answer is yes. In fact, and the answer gets at one of the most important results in all of economics. And I'd like you to really figure it out before going on. So imagine Lisa and Sam each want 1 waffle and 1 pie. They could do it by themselves, but figure out how through trade they can each get 1 waffle and 1 pie by working less time than if they work by themselves. This gets to the true economic magic of trade. So seriously, please pause the video and figure this one out on your own, because it really is one of the most important, or it's getting at one of the most important results in all of economics. Well, if the parties don't trade, it would take Lisa 3 hours to make a waffle and a pie. And of course, it would take Sam 9 plus 3, or 12 hours to make a waffle and a pie. But what if they specialized? What if Lisa made 2 waffles and Sam made 2 pies, and they traded 1 for 1. Well, now they each have 1 of each by the time they were done, and Lisa would have only had to work for 2 hours, and Sam would have only had to work for 6 hours. So they're both better off. Trade worked even though one of the parties had an absolute advantage in everything. So what's going on? Well, we can see how the parties can benefit from trade if we rewrite the costs of them making each good in terms of opportunity costs. So, for example, we know it takes Lisa on her own 1 hour to make a waffle and 2 hours to make a pie. So what is the opportunity cost to Lisa of making a pie if there's no trade? Well, opportunity cost is best opportunity lost. And since here there's only one other thing you can be doing, it's just opportunity lost. So if Lisa spends 2 hours making a pie, she's giving up 2 waffles. So the cost to Lisa of making a pie, it is 2 hours, but it's also 2 waffles, because she could have spent the 2 hours, instead of making a pie, making a waffle. Now, what's the cost to Lisa of making a waffle? Well, it's 1 hour, that's the resource cost, but she could have used that hour to bake half a pie. It takes her 2 hours to make a pie, so in 1 hour she could have made half of a pie. What about for Sam? Well, it takes Sam 9 hours to make a waffle. He could have spent those 9 hours making 3 pies. So because Sam can make a pie every 3 hours, so instead of spending 9 hours making a waffle, he could have spent those 9 hours making 3 pies. So the opportunity cost to Sam in a world without trade of making a waffle is that he gives up 3 pies. And what's the cost to Sam of making a pie? Well, that 3 hours he spent making a pie, he gave up the chance to make 1/3 of a waffle. So he lost a chance to make 1/3 of a waffle. So now in terms of the opportunity costs, we can see it's cheaper for Lisa to make a pie, and it's cheaper for Sam to make a waffle. So when you write it in terms of opportunity cost, now it makes sense that the parties can trade. Now this next part I'm not going to prove, but notice the 1/2 and 2, one is the reciprocal of the other, and the 3 and 1/3, those are also reciprocals. That would be true for any numbers I made. So you're always going to have, because of the reciprocal nature, it's either going to be by an incredible coincidence an exact tie, or one party is always going to have a lower opportunity cost of making a good than the other party. And because one party, will always have a lower opportunity cost in one good and the other party in the other, no matter what numbers I wrote down, the parties could always benefit from trade unless by a coincidence it happened to be an exact tie. And then if you went beyond 3 goods, you would never get it to, you'd almost never get it to be a tie. Lisa has what's called a comparative advantage in making waffles, while Sam has what's called a comparative advantage in making pies. You have a comparative advantage in the good you can make at a lower opportunity cost. Remember, you had an absolute advantage in the good you could make at a lower resource cost. The idea of trading based on comparative advantage was formulated first by the great economist David Ricardo. In future videos, we'll go into more detail about comparative advantage.